Level 1. Ethics Clerk. The file is still warm when it reaches your desk at 5:58. Not metaphorically, physically warm. Like it comes straight from someone's hands instead of the sealed document tube that drops it into your intake tray. Black folder, yellow stripe, internal priority marker, stamped twice across the top. Ethics Committee. Preliminary review. You have been in the office for 11 minutes. Your badge still feels temporary clipped to your blazer. The corridor outside is silent, carpeted, and windowless, in that expensive foundation way where every door looks ordinary, until it opens onto something that should not exist. A woman with silver glasses and a voice too calm to be casual stands beside your desk. Log it, she says. Do not assume the humane option is the ethical one. Then she leaves. That is how Level 1 begins. At this rank, you are an ethics clerk. You do not decide whether projects live or die. You prepare the cases that let other people pretend those decisions are structured. You route proposals, flag procedural violations, summarize casualties, and assemble the pieces of a moral disaster into something a committee can review before the next one arrives. You still think ethics means restraint. The foundation teaches you otherwise quickly. Your first assignment involves a low-level test proposal for an object that induces severe memory loss in anyone who touches it without insulated gloves. Research wants broader human testing. Security wants tighter access. Medical warns that repeated exposure appears cumulative. The object is classified as contained. The problem is not the object. The problem is the phrase buried in the request. D-class replacement quota available. You stare at it a little too long. By 8:40, you learn the first hidden rule of the committee. Nobody here asks whether suffering can be avoided entirely. The only question is whether the suffering is justified, limited, documented, and proportionate to what the foundation gains in return. That sounds controlled on paper. It feels different when you are the one preparing the paper. You read through exposure logs. Subject 4 loses 6 months of autobiographical memory. Subject 7 loses the ability to recognize his own face for 12 hours. Subject 9 repeatedly calls a dead sister's name, until sedation. You condense all of that into one line for the review brief. Observed cognitive degradation. Exceeds original risk estimate. The sentence is clean. The footage is not. At Level 1, you still believe language can save people if it is precise enough. You think a well-phrased objection will stop a bad test. You think clear documentation will shame the right person. You think the committee exists to pull the emergency brake every time the machine moves too fast. Then your supervisor marks up your summary in red. Too emotional, she says. You are not here to feel the file. You are here to structure the argument. That is the first change. You do not stop caring. You start organizing care into acceptable formats. By the end of your second month, you know which departments fear ethics most. Research fears delay. Security fears exposure of unofficial methods. Administration fears precedent. Medical fears being forced to say yes on paper to things they already do in silence. You also know the real currency of your rank, not morality. Clarity under pressure. At Level 1, you are still outside the decision. You do not yet understand that the decision is already moving toward you. Level 2, Review Officer. The hearing starts at 21:13. 3 researchers, 1 security captain, 1 medical administrator, 1 ethics observer, 1 locked room, 1 proposal projected onto a black screen. At the far end of the table, you are no longer just routing files. At Level 2, you are a review officer. Now you sit in the room while departments make their case. You ask questions. You identify omissions. You compare what is being requested to prior rulings, prior disasters, prior lies, told neatly enough to survive in documentation. Your badge opens higher floors now. Closed conference suites, restricted archive terminals, observation decks above chambers where approved under controlled conditions has already cost more than anyone likes to say aloud. The proposal tonight is simple in the way only Foundation proposals can be simple. A humanoid anomaly responds to emotional distress with increased compliance and information disclosure. Research wants to induce controlled grief in test subjects to improve interrogation results. Security supports the request because the anomaly may hold location data on 3 missing personnel. Medical calls the distress protocol reversible. Administration wants a quick decision because transport arrangements expire in 6 hours. You watch them present it like a scheduling problem. That is what this rank reveals. The deeper you go, the cleaner people become at describing cruelty when it is useful. You ask the first question. How many times has reversible distress remained reversible in comparable protocols over the last 5 years? Nobody answers immediately. That pause gives you status. Respect in ethics is earned by forcing the room to remember its own memory. The number, once provided, is worse than the proposal suggests. 7 comparable protocols, 2 full recoveries, 3 long-term psychiatric collapses, 1 suicide attempt during post-test quarantine, 1 subject still held under observation because he responds to family photographs by bleeding from the nose and repeating a phrase in a language he never speaks before. You recommend suspension, pending revised safeguards. Research hates you for 48 hours. Then a parallel file from another site confirms the anomaly, gives false statements under elevated distress. After the 3rd exposure cycle, your objection prevents months of useless suffering. No one congratulates you. At level 2, you learn another hidden rule. The committee is not loved when it is right. It is tolerated because the cost of ignoring it sometimes becomes impossible to bury. You start reading faster, thinking colder. You no longer flinch when a file lists casualty estimates before staff names. You stop writing painful in your notes and start writing high-severity burden. You stop believing that cleaner language means cleaner hands. You still go home at night. You just bring the room with you. Level 3, Committee Investigator. The first time they send you below the file, it is 327 and raining above ground. You are in a service elevator with a security escort, 1 sealed evidence case, and a transfer order signed by 2 site directors who hate each other enough that the paperwork alone tells you something is wrong. At level 3, you are a committee investigator. This is where the role becomes dangerous. You no longer review only what departments choose to show you. You inspect test sites, interview survivors, audit chambers, pull raw footage, compare witness statements, and determine whether the truth in the report matches the truth in the room. Sometimes it does. Usually, not completely. Your first field inquiry concerns a terminated cross-test in sublevel 5. Official summary. Unanticipated escalation. Procedure followed. Acceptable losses within emergency doctrine. The wording is polished enough to be suspicious. The chamber smells faintly of ozone and antiseptic. 1 wall still bears scratch marks beneath the repaint. The attending researcher speaks too quickly. The security lieutenant answers only what you ask, which is better than over-explaining. The medic assigned to the test refuses eye contact until you request the raw sedation log. That is where the crack appears. The approved protocol allows a maximum of 4 minutes of direct exposure. The sedation record begins at minute 9. You ask why. The researcher says there are promising indications. At minute 5, you ask why the committee is not notified of protocol extension. He says the window is narrow and the data is unprecedented. You ask who authorizes the extension. He looks at the lieutenant. Now the room tells you the truth without words. At level 3, you begin understanding power inside ethics. Not the power to stop everything, the power to make people reveal what they gamble with when they think oversight is too slow. You secure the footage. You interview the surviving D-class handler, who says the subject keeps asking whether the second voice in the chamber belongs to him. You recommend immediate suspension, formal censure, and review of all off-hours testing by that project team. The recommendation goes through. The researcher loses project access. The lieutenant is reassigned. The medic thanks you in a stairwell and then looks ashamed for doing it. That moment stays with you, because by now you know every intervention carries a secondary cost. Slow the testing, and containment knowledge lags. Punish the wrong person too hard, and other teams learn to hide better. Push too gently, and everyone assumes ethics is theater. You tell yourself you are balancing a blade. In truth, the blade is balancing you. Level 4, Senior Ethics Analyst. The proposal arrives in 3 binders and a locked drive. No deadline on the cover. That is worse than urgency. Urgent files want speed. Important files want ownership. At level 4, you are a Senior Ethics Analyst. Now you shape what the committee thinks before the room ever meets. Junior reviewers build summaries for you. Investigators send raw findings upward. Administrators ask whether a project can proceed if 1 paragraph changes. Site director call for context, which means they want to hear your likely position before they commit themselves publicly. You work in precedent now, not emotion, not instinct. Chains of prior rulings, casualty comparison, containment value analysis, personnel fatigue curves, collateral exposure models. You know which prior disaster resembles the new proposal closely enough to stop it. You know which phrase will make research rewrite a methodology without formally accusing them of sadism. You know how much fear to leave visible in the document and how much to convert into neutral language, so the committee does not dismiss it as panic. The file on your desk concerns a long-term isolation protocol for a sentient anomaly that becomes exponentially more dangerous when given social interaction. Security wants permanent solitary containment, Medical warns of rapid psychological degradation. Research argues limited contact may produce a safe communication model. Administration notes the cost of full sensory isolation. Chambers is $2.8 million annually and rising. The obvious answer is not obvious for long. You spend 12 hours in footage archives watching the anomaly speak politely to every person it later manipulates. You review prior attempts at limited contact. One researcher develops obsessive loyalty after 6 conversations. One guard opens a blast door without remembering why. One therapist records measurable empathy in the anomaly. Right before it engineers a coordinated suicide attempt in 2 adjacent cells. By morning, you write the analysis. Continued interaction produces morally meaningful suffering reduction in the short term, while measurably increasing catastrophic risk in the long term. Recommended outcome: isolation, with rotating non-interactive observational oversight, quarterly review, and compensatory welfare requirements where operationally feasible. This is what Level 4 does to you. It teaches you to build sentences that sound humane, while approving conditions that would ruin any ordinary mind. You hate that the recommendation is probably correct. You hate more that your hatred does not change the recommendation. Your influence grows. Departments start adapting proposals before they reach you. Younger committee staff, watch how you take apart arguments and reassemble them into rulings that can survive contact with real operations. Your name begins to carry weight outside ethics. That weight is not admiration. It is caution. Level 5. Committee chair. They wait for you to sit before anyone else does. That is how you know the room belongs to you now. At Level 5, you are committee chair. The hearings no longer pass through you. They converge on you. You set agenda, frame the question, allocate speaking time, narrow options, and decide whether the committee acts as brake, scalpel, or witness. Research directors stop pretending not to care what you think. Security chiefs brief their people before coming into your room. Site administrators adjust language in advance because they know one phrase from you can stall an entire operation. Power here is procedural and absolute in specific moments. Tonight's hearing concerns a breach site wing and a proposed termination protocol for 47 exposed staff who may become vectors if the anomaly's secondary effect manifests. Medical says the symptoms are not fully predictive. Security says waiting could compromise the entire site. Administration says evacuation is impossible without public exposure. The site director wants a ruling within 1 hour. Everyone speaks carefully. Then they all look at you. This is the first time the committee feels less like ethics and more like triage with legal vocabulary. You ask for the probability range. Medical says 18 to 61%. Security says that uncertainty is itself intolerable. Research wants 1 more hour of data. 1 more hour means the exposed staff remain alive, conscious, and aware they are being discussed. You authorize segmented quarantine, emergency sedation, and conditional termination, only if 3 biometric thresholds align. Not a clean no, not a full yes. A narrow gate built to slow catastrophe by fraction. 12 staff survive who would have been written off under security's plan. 5 die later, when the thresholds trigger exactly as predicted. The site director privately calls the decision elegant. You do not sleep that night. At Level 5, you learn leadership inside. Ethics is not about purity. It is about making sure ugly necessity passes through at least one room where someone still forces it to explain itself. But even that becomes a kind of vanity if you are not careful. You begin hearing your own voice in the room before you speak. That is dangerous. Chairs can become thrones if people stop challenging them. So you cultivate dissent deliberately. Invite the hard questions. Keep 1 member on every review team who annoys you in useful ways. It helps. Not enough. Because with every good decision, the room trusts you more. And with every increase in trust, it becomes easier for your judgment to harden into doctrine. Level 6, Site Ethics Director. The site alarm stops for exactly 19 seconds. That silence is worse than the noise. At Level 6, you are Site Ethics Director. The committee is no longer a distant room you summon when needed. It is built into site command through you. You attend crisis briefings, containment planning, personnel reviews, medical triage discussions, research acceleration requests, and emergency cover meetings. You are not there to moralize. You are there to decide how far the site is allowed to go before it starts eating the people inside it faster than the anomalies do. A containment cascade in Sector D kills external communications and disables 2 failsafes. Security wants permission for corridor flooding with anesthetic gas and thermobaric fallback if the gas fails. Research insists 1 chamber contains irreplaceable data. Medical reports. 31 staff unaccounted for between the flood line and the collapse zone. The site director asks, what can we live with afterward? That is what your rank becomes. Not what is right, what can still be carried tomorrow. You authorize the gas. You deny thermobaric use pending one additional scan. That 13-minute delay allows security to recover 6 trapped staff before the secondary rupture. It also gives one anomaly time to cross into an adjacent wing, where it kills 2 technicians and forces a 12-hour lockdown. If you approve the fire solution immediately, those 6 die, and the spread may never occur. If you wait longer than you do, more than 2 technicians die, and the adjacent wing becomes uncontainable. This is the kind of math that breaks ordinary people. The Foundation promotes you for doing it repeatedly. At level 6, you start losing the ability to explain your work honestly, even to yourself. You are no longer just reviewing suffering. You are budgeting it in crisis. Choosing which moral damage becomes survivable institutional damage. Signing off on things that would horrify the younger version of you. And then noticing, with equal horror, that the signature line no longer makes your hand shake. The site begins to orbit you differently. Research seeks your shield. Security resents and respects your interference. Administration wants your rulings because rulings reduce liability. Staff begins saying, ethics won't allow it, or ethics already approved it, and both statements mean your judgment is now infrastructure. That is power. It is also contamination of another kind. Level 7, Overwatch Ethics Liaison. The room has no clocks. That is deliberate. At level 7, you are Overwatch Ethics Liaison. You do not represent one site anymore. You sit between the Ethics Committee, site leadership, regional command, and the people above all of them who almost never need to explain themselves. You see cross-site projects, global containment directives, black budget experiments, multi-regional casualty forecasts, and doctrine proposals written for events so large, ordinary staff would not survive understanding them fully. You no longer ask whether a single protocol is ethical in isolation. You ask what kind of institution the Foundation becomes if that protocol is normalized. That question gives you real leverage. A proposal lands on your desk at 1:42, coordinated activation of a low-grade amnestic aerosol over 3 metropolitan zones following simultaneous anomalous exposures. It would prevent mass panic, contain secondary mimetic spread, and preserve secrecy. It would also erase 6 to 18 hours of memory from roughly 2.3 million people, with uncertain effects on a statistically small but not negligible number of vulnerable minds. Operations wants immediate pre-authorization. Administration wants contingency language. Medical wants liability insulation. You want someone in the room to admit what this actually is, so you make them say it. Not memory management, not continuity preservation. Population-scale cognitive assault in defense of containment. The phrase changes the room. That is what your rank buys you. The power to force honest naming before a lie becomes doctrine. The operation is not approved as proposed. You force narrower dispersal thresholds, layered regional triggers, and a clause that requires direct sign-off from the highest oversight tier if civilian impact exceeds revised projections. Millions are not affected. Tens of thousands still are, when the smaller operation activates 3 months later. You count that as success. That is what frightens you. At level 7, the committee stops being a conscience and becomes a constitutional pressure system inside an organization that survives by making exceptions. Your job is to define the edge of those exceptions without losing the war against what waits outside the fence. Too rigid, and sites die. Too flexible, and the Foundation becomes the thing it claims to defend the world from. You begin to understand that every powerful institution eventually needs someone close to the top whose only job is to remain difficult. That person is you. No one likes it for long. Level 8, Ethics Committee. Overseer. The final room is quieter than the rest. No spectators, no presenters, no waiting chairs. Just a long black table, sealed files, filtered air, and people who have spent so many years near consequential decisions that they barely move when they change the future. At level 8, you are Ethics Committee Overseer. Not a reviewer, not a chair. The final architecture of resistance inside the Foundation. You no longer fight over one project, one site, one proposal. You decide what kinds of moral injury are ever allowed to become policy. You arbitrate between continuity and humanity at a level where entire cities, site networks, and generations of staff exist as downstream consequences of a sentence you approve or kill. This is the myth of the rank from below, ultimate moral authority. The truth is worse. You do not control the foundation. You define how monstrous it is permitted to become while still calling itself necessary. That boundary moves. You move with it. A sealed directive arrives at 5:03. Global event modeling, multi-site breach contingencies, projected failure rates, civilian panic bans, recommended response trees. One option includes pre-authorized liquidation of all exposed site personnel in selected scenarios to prevent cross-contamination before site command can fragment. Another authorizes a class of public deception so large it would rewrite the remembered cause of a national disaster. Both options are operationally sound. Both are ethically corrosive. One is likely inevitable. This is the final cost of the rank. Not that you see horror. Everyone in the Foundation sees horror eventually. The cost is that you become responsible for which horror the institution learns to live with. You reject one directive, rewrite the other, force language that binds future action to measurable thresholds, documented review, and sunset expiration, before emergency logic calcifies into permanent appetite. It is not enough. It is the most anyone can do from this chair. You understand now why no one at the top sounds triumphant. Power here does not feel like victory. It feels like isolation, with better access. Every decision distances you further from simpler moral worlds. Outside the Foundation, people think ethics is a shield against evil. Inside, you know ethics is more often a hand pressed against a door that keeps trying to open wider. At 5:58, somewhere on a lower floor, a new ethics clerk receives a warm file in a black folder with a yellow stripe, fresh badge, cautious hands, still capable of believing that words, arranged correctly, might stop the worst thing in the room. A supervisor beside them says, "Log it. Do not assume the humane option is the ethical one." The clerk looks down at the folder for a second too long. You know that hesitation. You know what comes after it. First they structure the argument. Then they enter the room. Then the room enters them. And the file moves forward.